Alright, let's get started. So the idea is that we're going to take out this small Toyota E-Series diff that came standard with the Cressida. These are about a 7 or a 7.5 inch ring gear. That's just going to snap because it's open diff as well once the 220 kilowatts of that V8 is applied to it. And we're going to replace it with this Toyota Hilux diff here. So this came out of an 04 diesel Hilux. I believe it's a 8.5, 8.75 inch pinion, so much stronger. Plus the gearing is in the high 3 point something. So with that acceleration, this car is going to absolutely fly off the starting line. It's going to be great. So we've got all brand new brake parts to go on it, because that's one of the only areas I will be spending money is brake parts and fuel lines on this car. So we've got brand new brakes to go on it. But anyway, what we need to do is figure out what our pinion angle is on this diff, so that when we put the new one in, everything will line up correctly. And also we're going to make sure the pinion angle on the diff is the same as the back of the transmission, so that we have equal opposites, I think it's called, where the drive shaft will then sit level and it's not all janky and on the wrong angles and bind up the uni joints. So before we jack it up, we'll get under there, we'll measure those angles, then we'll jack it up, pull this off, and then work out how we're going to convert the leaf spring. Ooh, pretty Sylvia, I love that car when it's working. Convert the leaf springs of the Hilux diff and change it to the coil springs that are on this diff. So anyway, once we pull them out, I'll show you what I mean. Yeah, let's start pulling them out. Well, it's the next day, and as you can see, we now have a giant hole where a diff once was. So a little bit trickier to pull it out than I anticipated, but once the bolts kind of unloosened themselves with the rust, it wasn't too bad. So what we have now is our two diffs side by side, so we actually get a decent size comparison. So the one on the right hand side here, that is the factory E-Series diff, and as you can see, it is actually quite small around the tube there when you compare it to the Hilux diff that's going into it. As for width, hopefully you can see there, the Hilux diff is only a little bit wider, which is great. It's going to help put the wheels further out, so it will fill the guards better and look a bit nicer. So we don't have to go shortening it at all. And just in general, it is just a lot bigger, and it's going to handle the power a lot better than that tiny little E-Series. So the other thing, doing a little bit of research last night, the Hilux diff actually has a 4.5 ratio in it, so it's going to make this car accelerate something crazy, which is really fun. But also too, it's very easy to find other ratios that fit, because it's so common and there's so many different engine combinations and transmission combinations in this generation of Hilux. If it is too high of a gear, we can always find a lower gear and whack that in there. So that's really cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to strip the Hilux diff down. So we'll pull all the axles out, pull all the brake gear off, and then that way it just makes it as light as possible, because it's very heavy to try lift by myself. So we'll pull all that out, and then we'll start chopping off all the leaf spring mounts, all the brake lines and everything. We'll take all of that off because we don't need any of it, and then we can come back and start making a plan to put the coilover mounts onto this thing. So yeah, time lapse, let's clean this Hilux diff up. right, boys and girls, I have made a bit of a mistake. So we've pulled all, well, part of the brakes off anyway. I didn't realise I could just pull the drive shafts out with all the brakes actually attached, which is good. They're in okay condition now. The housing was open when I first found it, so there's a little bit of rust and moisture in there that needs to be cleaned up. But otherwise, everything appears to be in good condition. Now, we've managed to sit the diff under here about where it's going to go. So it's off by only a couple of mil. It's sitting at the right angle. It needs to be 3 degrees up, which it's now sitting thanks to the scissor jack. And it is sitting so that the input shaft is in line with the output of the gearbox. Now, the problem we have is something I didn't even account for, and hopefully I can pick it up when I come around here. The diff is too far offset to the right hand side, so on the too far to the left hand side. So on the left hand side, the tyre will be sticking out past the guard, and on the right hand side the tyre will be rubbing on the inner guard, so it doesn't actually line up good at all. So we need to reassess our pinion offset and see if we can somehow make this all work without chopping and cutting up the actual diff itself, because A, I don't want to do that, and B, I don't have the ability to do that, so that's going to be a bit hard. So I'm going to scratch my head a little bit here and try to figure something out. We'll take some measurements. The first thing we're going to do is take the starter motor off the engine, because it hits against the bottom's on, so I can't show you. But anyway, the starter motor hits on the chassis rails on this side when I actually align the gearbox up straight. So we need to take that off and notch the chassis so that it has room. But if we take that off, then we can center our engine and driveline correctly, see how far the output shaft is off the start again, I'm getting confused now. So yeah, now we need to align the engine and transmission so that it's straight, figure out what its offset is from the center line of the chassis, and then find out what the input shaft is, how far that is off the center line of the chassis, and see how much movement we need to adjust kind of in this direction. So we've got up and down, the pinion angle, that's fine, we can work within that, that's going to be no problem. But yeah, the actual offset as to where it all aligns with the center line of the chassis is what I need to measure next. So that's going to be me scratching my head quite a bit because I'm learning as I'm going. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll bring you back with some measurements, and hopefully I will have figured something out. So yeah, here we go. To the right of the chassis by 5mm, which means that we have a measurement of 680 from the chassis rail to the center line of our output shaft on the transmission. We've got a storm rolling in, so hopefully that rain's not too bad. Now, so that's all running good. So I'm off center line by 5mm on our output. So then we go to our input. Now I positioned the diff about where it needs to be to sit even, which is, according to my measurements anyway, it's sitting where it is. They're not completely accurate measurements, but they're a great ballpark to see if we can even make this work. So where I've positioned the diff, it is currently 20, no it's not, yes it is, it's 20mm off center line from our chassis. So it's 695 from our chassis rail to our center line of our diff, which yeah, makes us 20mm right of our center line. That means we have a difference of 15mm between the center line of our transmission and the center line of our diff, which, when you consider that this is going to have a custom one-piece shaft made, because I cannot make it myself and I want it to be balanced properly, so I'm not going to cut a well one myself. We will get a custom one made. That's going to be a one-piece shaft, so 15mm over that distance, I feel, is not going to cause us that much drama, considering we're not building a full-on race car. Now, also another thing to note, keep up with me here, is that, as I mentioned before, my measurements weren't completely accurate, and I've actually got the diff positioned 5mm too far to the right-hand side. So once that comes back to the left, we correct our distance between our output and our input. We are actually only 10mm off the center lines not aligning properly. So this race getting really heavy. I hope that makes sense. Hopefully I can watch this back later and figure out what the hell I did there. So I'm going to go inside before I get rained out and flooded in my shed. I'll catch you when the storm rain ends. Yeah, hopefully it's soon. Alright, diff school is in. So after a bit of googling and measuring, we've now figured out how we're going to make this Hilux diff actually work in relation to the Cressida's chassis. So the first thing we have is pinion angle, and that's the relation of the output of your transmission to the input of your diff and the different angles that is. So originally, with the V8 and the 4-speed transmission in there, we have 3 degrees of downward angle, and the original Toyota diff we had 1 degree of down angle as well. So with our new diff, we have to rotate it back slightly to allow for 3 degrees of up angle to match the 3 degrees of down angle on the output of the transmission. So that one's easy, and I was able to calculate that one pretty fine. But what I didn't account for was the diff offset, and that is the relation of the centerline of the input shaft of the diff to the centerline of the chassis. And I didn't know this was an existent thing, and so now we've done a bunch of measurements on our car to make sure, or to see how this diff is going to fit into this chassis. So between the chassis rails we're 1350 millimeters. All these measurements are millimeters, so keep that in mind. That makes the chassis line of our car 675 millimeters. Now the center line of our output from our transmission is 680, which means that the center line of the trans is 5 millimeters to the right of the center line of the chassis. So now we translate that down into, I'll do the same equation I should say, down on our diff. The center line of our diff is 695, which makes it 20 millimeters to the right hand side of the chassis center line. So what we have is a variation of 15 millimeters between the output of our transmission and the input of our diff. Now that means that our drive shaft, when if it's going down this way in a straight line, it's going to be kinked ever so slightly to the right hand side. Now 15 millimeters over the distance of a solid drive shaft. This will be a custom drive shaft. I'm not going to muck around trying to weld my own. I do not want a rotating mass coming flying up through the wall, so that's going to be done properly and balanced correctly from a shop down in Kalgoorlie. Now at the end of the day, 15 millimeters is not that much, especially when we're talking about a bush car. Now if this was a professional race car or even a street vehicle, you will want that drive shaft as straight as possible. Well, with our application, we'll just have to see how it all pans out. But that is our equations. This diff is going to fit into the rear end of this car. Now we just have to chop off all the leaf spring mounts and start figuring out a way to weld all of the coil spring mounts onto that diff, all while keeping their right locations and orientations with each other. And oh dear, let's start chopping up the old one first, eh? We are making good progress. It's been hard work. It definitely was a as big as a job as I expected, maybe a bit bigger. Getting the actual seats off were definitely the hardest. All the bracketry, that was easy to get off. But I'm currently at a stage now where I've overheated my grinder, so I need to stop, let it cool down, and then we'll carry on flappy disking the rest of it off. But I won't bore you guys with that too much. This is definitely going to be a couple of episodes to get this diff in. It was the largest job I had left to do on this car, and it definitely is. I'm learning a lot as we're going along about the pinion angle and the diff offset, all that, which is really cool. But also just the actual physical work. I'm covered in sweat at the moment. It's just pouring off me. It's bloody hot here at the moment. And yeah, we've got to carry on doing this. So I'll spare you that. I'll chop all the parts off the old diff that we need to keep. And then next time you see us, we'll be welding them all into place and trying to line it all up. So there's a bit of maths in that as well. So I've got to go off and figure out how I'm going to go do that. Now, enough rambling. Thank you very much for watching. It feels really good to get some more progress on this build done. And yeah, we'll catch you guys on another episode of Automotive Carnage. See you then.